My name is Greg Reed. I was born August the 11th, 1948, and I was born in Fayetteville, Arkansas, in the Old City Hospital, but I was raised in Morrow, Arkansas.
Okay, Greg, this interview is for the Prairie Grove Oral History Project, and we just want to be sure that we have your permission to use the interview.
You do.
Thank you, Greg. Who were your parents?
My parents were Dale Reed and Mary Cusick Reed.
Tell me about your siblings.
I have two brothers younger than me, Rick Reed, he's 4 years younger than me, and Pete Reed, or Preston, as his real name, was 4 years younger than Rick.
Okay, and tell me about your family business when you were growing up.
Well, the first thing, Dad drove a truck for Cuddy Hay Packing Company out of Lincoln. And then when he quit that, we bought some land down at Morrow in town and built a chicken house, and we raised chickens for several years.
Okay. What was your part in the family business on the farm?
Feeding chickens, milking cows, and anything to do with the farm. We only had 10 acres, which was where the chicken houses were. And then we had a milk cow and a big garden, of course. That was about it. I fed chickens and cleaned waters and did whatever Dad told me to do.
What other jobs did you have when you were a kid?
I guess my first job was mowing the lawn for Mrs. Harris. I think it paid me 75 cents, and it was a pretty big lawn, but I did that, and then when I was 13, I went to work for Bill Nolan, driving a tractor, pulling the Easy Flow. He came over to the house and tried to get Dad to work for him, and Dad couldn't do it, but he suggested I do it. And so I went over there, but before I did, I told Dad I'd never driven one of the kind of tractors Bill had. And then Dad said, well, you just tell him that. So when I was climbing up on that C International tractor, I told Mr. Nolan, I said, I've never driven this kind of tractor. And he laughed and said, well, I could see by the way you were looking at it that you hadn't, appreciate you admitting it. So he taught me how to drive a C International with a tricycle front end on it and turn it in the loose dirt, and we made it fine. I worked for him. He died, and then I worked for Mrs. Nolan until I was in college.
And where did you go to college?
I went to Carl Albert, it was Poto Community College then, on the basketball and baseball scholarship, and then I transferred to the University of Arkansas.
Tell me about your first job out of college, or your job.
Well, my first job out of college was working for the Farmers and Merchants Bank. I first applied at the Prairie Grove Telephone Company and Donald Parks, and I didn't get hired, and so I walked out, and the next door I came to was the Farmers and Merchants Bank, so I decided I had to start somewhere, so I walked in there, and the first answer was no, but they called me about 3 days later and offered me a job.
Tell me about going to work for the bank. What did you do when you first started?
I was a teller, and Judy Carter trained me, and I worked as a regular teller for about a year, and then I moved over to note teller, which was what Jim Reef was doing until he moved to a loan desk. And then in 1974, they remodeled the bank and made me a loan officer that year.
What was the bank like in those early years? What year did you first start to work there?
1969 was the first when I started to work there, and I was the 11th employee, and I think our assets, our total footings were like $6.2 million, and today it's well over $200 million.
Tell me more. What did you do as a note teller? What did that involve?
Well, basically taking payments on notes and sending out notices, and at that time we had escrow contracts, were contracts between two individuals, and we acted as an agent and collected the payments on those and distributed the funds.
Tell me how that would work.
Excuse me?
Like a note between two different people, you collected
Yes.
it. So how might that work?
Well, we would they would send their payments in to us. We would figure the interest and credit it to the note, and then disperse the funds.
Okay. So who was the manager of the bank when you worked there? And tell me about working for him.
Delford Reef was the first manager. He was the president of the bank when I initially started, and we used to get laughed at by the state bank examiners because we were the only bank in Arkansas that had a no smoking sign on the door. Delford Reef was allergic to cigarette smoke, so we had no smoking in the bank, and banks used to give out matchbooks, and we stopped that when we stopped the smoking in the bank. But Delford taught me a lot about banking. I'm trying to think of some of the things that he taught me. Oh, one of the things he always said was kind of interesting was you couldn't borrow your way out of debt. And a lot of people tried to do that. They thought the way to get out of debt was just borrow more money and get bigger. And that wasn't the case with a lot of them.
Tell me about your earliest memories coming to Prairie Grove.
I guess my earliest memories of coming to Prairie Grove were on Saturday on the Trades Day, and you couldn't find a place to park. You would go down the street where the old police department is and the Arvest Drive-In Bank and make a U-turn and come back and then go down to the station the other side of the old Tasco store and make another U-turn until you found a parking place. And you always go to the Crescent department store, and Elton Skelton was running it then. He had taken it over from his dad, Guy, and I remember anytime you walked in, Elton would say hello and call you by name and come on in, we'll be with you in just a minute. And he was quite the salesman.
What other stores do you remember going in and trading with?
Well, there was Carmen Drugstore. I remember when I was going to have my tonsils out, and we stopped by the drugstore, and somehow Mrs. Carmen, Riata Carmen, found out I was going to have my tonsils out, and she gave me 3 comic books to read, and I'll never forget that. And there was Neil's Dry Goods and the Harlan Variety Store. I always enjoyed going in there and looking at all the stuff in the variety dime store.
What other stores did you do business with that you can think of?
Well, other than the bank and, I guess we did a little bit with Southern Mercantile, Florence Hill. But mainly it was Crescent's department store and the Carmen drugstore, or the Sterling drugstore. They both had fountains, as I recall, soda fountains, and we would go in there and get a soda, and that was a big treat.
Let's talk about how you left Farmers and Merchants Bank and then eventually came back to run what had been that bank.
In 1986, I left Farmers and Merchants Bank after 17 years and went to Clinton, Arkansas, to a new bank as president of that bank. And I was only in Clinton for about 6 months when Jim Walton called, and I wound up coming back to Prairie Ridge as president of the Bank of Prairie Ridge. And I worked there until November of 1990, and that's when Arvest bought First Federal of Fayetteville, which was a failed institution that had a branch in Prairie Grove. And I came to it, and we changed the name to First Prairie Grove Bank, and we were there for 2 years. And in 1992, we purchased Farmers and Merchants Bank and operated it as Farmers and Merchants until 2001, and we changed the name then to Arvest and consolidated all the Arvest banks under one charter.
Were you involved in the negotiation of the deal with Delford, or was that done by others?
Well, that was kind of strange. Jim Walton called me one day and said, I want you to go buy either the Farmers and Merchants Bank or the Bank of Lincoln or both of them. And I said, well, Jim, I've never done anything like that. And he said, you go talk to them, and if they're interested, I'll send Rick Chapman down to help you. And so that's what I did. Bank of Lincoln wasn't interested, but Farmers and Merchants people were interested, so that's why we wound up buying them.
What was it like whenever you took over your old bank?
Well, I knew most of the people there. There were some new ones that had come since I had been there before, but most of the old hands, Judy Carter and Lavon Hall and Pat Holloway and Pat Hand and Carolyn Boyle and Sandy Whitehouse, they were all still there. So it was kind of like coming home. I knew most of them. Arvest made a lot of changes. We did things a lot different than what the old Farmers and Merchants Bank, and for the most part it was accepted pretty well by the employees. There was a few that decided they couldn't live with the changes and moved on, but by and large, most of them stayed and retired there.
What was the size of the bank when you first took it over from F&M, and then what was the size of it when you retired?
It was about 50 million when we first took it over. And then we combined First Prairie Grove with it, and that made it about 60 million. And then it was about 210 million when I retired in August of 14.
Talk about growing the bank and kind of what that was like during those years.
Well, it was different, and the customers had to get used to a lot of things different, but I can tell you from experience, and the regulators looked at small banks and big banks a lot different. And while I didn't think of Arvest as a big bank, the examiners did. And so they were much tougher in some ways and more detailed in their examinations. But by and large, we just went into what we called a sales mode and started working on the sales of our products. And banking is banking, and everybody pretty much offered the same products at that time. So you had to differentiate yourself basically by customer service, and delivering quality customer service was a high priority with Arvest.
How did you take what you learned from Delford Reef and the old bank and Jim Walton and the new bank and use those together?
Well, initially, Arvest operated their banks as independent banks. Each one had their own charter. So I was given the latitude to operate pretty much however I felt a small town needed to operate. And Delford had taught me a lot about investments and lending money, and Jim Reef and Wilfred Thompson, of course, were there when I was there the first time, and I learned some things from all of them. And it basically transferred over pretty well to Arvest. Like I said, we had our own board, we had our own policies for the first 10 or 12 years before regulations made it, or almost required it, to consolidate all the charters into one bank. And then I felt like we were looked at differently by the examiners. They became more nitpicky, I'd say. But actually, it was very similar. The regulations have just increased over the years and got more and more stringent and made it more and more difficult to take care of the customers the way they were used to being taken care of in Prairie Grove.
When you first went to work for F&M Bank, were y'all open on Saturdays then?
They had just quit opening on Saturdays, I think in December, before I went to work in January. So we were open 9 to 3, and everybody thought that was all we worked, but actually I would get to work about 7 to 7:30, and sometimes didn't get off till after 6, because there was a lot of work that went on before and after the bank closed.
Who were some of the customers that you can remember doing business with that was maybe some of your favorites, or some of the ones that you got to know real well?
Oh, there were several. The local merchants, probably Guy Sparks, who had the old IGA store right across the street. Elton Skelton. Elton used to finance a lot of cars. He'd sell cars on the side. And he would finance those, and we'd buy those notes from him. And I enjoyed dealing with him. I don't know, there were so many that I enjoyed. Kenny Bartholomew had the B&K grocery down the street. Howard Fiddler and Mike Fiddler had the old Tasco store, and of course there was the Parks brothers that had the telephone company. I always enjoyed my interaction with all them. I knew a lot of the people down around Morrow who did business with the bank. A lot of the farmers, the Quintons and the McCradocks, and of course the Reeds, and first one and the Cusick's, there was a lot of them. And I always enjoyed visiting with the old hometown folks.
Even though you grew up down the road in Morrow, didn't you? How did you feel like in Prairie Grove? Did you feel like they pretty much accepted you as part of the community?
Oh yeah, you know, when I grew up in Morrow and Lincoln, we'd come to Prairie Grove to check out the girls, and I wound up marrying a girl from Prairie Grove. But yeah, I felt like I was accepted pretty well. If you treat them right, they'd treat you right.
Um, when you were a kid growing up in this area, what would you and your friends do for fun?
Well, down around Mar, we didn't go to the movies or things like that very much. We pretty much entertained ourselves down on the creek. Homer Jr. Snodgrass had the Boy Scout troop in Lincoln, of which I was a member of, and I always enjoyed that. And he spent a lot of time and effort working with us boys, and I appreciated that. But mainly running up and down the creek, camping and fishing and doing stuff like that was our leisure time.
When you moved to Prairie Grove and after college and was working here, what would you and your friends do for fun in those days, kids your age, or young adults your age?
Well, we lived across the street from Mel and Barbara Ireland. And Mel got killed in 1978 in a car wreck, but we'd go to the lake and do a lot of camping and skiing and boating and swimming with them. There was a supper club in Prairie Grove, and we were members of that. And once a month, we would meet at someone's house, and they'd furnish part of the meat and stuff, and the rest of us would bring the side dishes for a meal. And of course, we had the Lions Club, and we played in softball tournaments. The Lions Club had a softball team. We enjoyed doing that. Other than that, and doing sports with your kids and activities with your children was about it.
Tell me about your wife and your family in Prairie Grove.
Well, like I say, I had two sons, Dale and Clay. And Dale actually graduated from Pea Ridge High School, and Clay graduated from Prairie Grove. We had moved back by that time. I'm trying to think. Basically, they were all involved in all the school activities, and we participated in those, or the kids did, and we attended a lot of ball games and spent many hours sitting on the bleachers.
I know. Tell me about your earliest memories of going to use the Battlefield Park.
Well, I remember driving by the Battlefield Park on Labor Day weekend and the clothesline fair, and I had never been to it until I moved to Prairie Grove. And then the Lions Club always had the concessions and ran the concession part of the Labor Day celebration and the square dancing. And I remember when I first moved here, we'd square dance at the Ladder Barn, and the Lions Club would build a stage out there, and there was maybe 20 groups that square danced. And now then, I think there's better than 60 groups that square dance down at the amphitheater in the park. But I guess one of my first memories of Battlefield Park is working up there during Labor Day.
Now, you were involved later with when the park decided to be expanded. I think you were for some time on the board, the Friends of Battlefield Park. Can you tell me
Yes.
about kind of how that happened and wanting to expand the park?
Well, the Friends of the Battlefield Park was started to help the park and keep their facilities upgraded and everything. And then they decided they wanted to expand the park, and they started looking at all the land around it. And having lived in Pea Ridge near their military park, I realized what a conflict that could cause with the community, and I was not in favor of all the park expansion, and they decided to replace me on the Friends of the Battlefield Park at that time.
What are some stories you can think of about Prairie Grove, or some of the things that happened in the time that you've lived here and worked here? Maybe something I hadn't thought to ask about.
Well, I think one of the biggest deals you've already seen and heard about was the water tower that fell on the Crescent department store. I was standing across the street watching the operation, and it was kind of a shocking moment when it fell and you realized it had hit the Crescents and B&K Market and all that. But that was probably one of the most traumatic times. I served on a group that Donald Parks actually started to get a medical clinic here in Prairie Grove. And the Parks family donated the land and most of the cash to build the clinic. And it was a rural health clinic, and later turned over to Manna, which now operates First Prairie Grove. But the Parks family, and Donald Parks in particular, was very instrumental in getting that started. And without them, it wouldn't have happened.
I know there were a lot of things over years that the Parks family did kind of behind the scenes to help the community. Can you think of other examples?
Well, I guess since they're gone now, Donald and Barry, they wouldn't mind me telling us some of them, but specific examples were like the paving of the parking lot behind the stores on the south side of the street. They couldn't come up with enough money, so Arvest Bank and the Parks family put up a good portion of the money to pave that parking lot back there. And they were always doing something to help the community. Donald Parks got in trouble a few times for mowing property. His philosophy, as he told me one time, was you need to mow your lawn 3 days before it needs it. And he was a very civic-minded person. He served on the city council, and I remember I was recorder treasurer for the city, and we had a meeting, and we had a new sheriff or marshal in town, and you could tell he gave a report every council meeting, and you could tell he was very proud of himself because he had written 134 tickets that month, and he was looking for the council to pat him on the back for the revenue he had raised. And Donald Parks spoke up and said, well, I'll tell you when I'll be proud of you is when you can come in here and say you didn't have to write a single ticket. Then I'll know you're doing your job. And I thought that had a lot of deep meaning to it. And you had to respect Donald because he didn't want Prairie Grove to become known as a feed trap. And the next month, there's feeding tickets were way down, but so were the feed trucks. The traffic, the speed way down. So I think he was successful getting his point across.
Tell me about when you served for Recorder Treasurer for the city. How long did you do that, and what are some of the things you can remember?
Well, actually, I was a recorder treasurer for 4 years. And during that time, I think we hired our first clerk because the city was growing, had more business, and needed a full-time recorder treasurer. Of course, I was only part-time. During that time, I wound up serving 6 months as the acting mayor because the mayor resigned, and that was a very interesting time, what all the mayor had to put up with and do, and I was more than happy to give up that job.
What year was that in? And tell me a little bit about being there.
Well, I remember one night, the year was between 70 and 74. And I remember one night the phone ringing in the middle of the night, and I answered it, and there was a lady complaining about the neighbor had a rooster crowing and was waking her up and keeping her awake. And she asked me what I was going to do about it. And I said, well, other than having chicken and dumplings for dinner, I don't know anything I can do. And she hung up. But I called the people, and they got rid of the rooster.
Any other stories you can think of as serving as mayor or during your banking days?
Well, one time I know when I was still recorder treasurer, Lee King, who had moved here, owned some property where Magnatech was located. It was just a field in, and the city was looking for some land to start an industrial park. And Lee was asking a pretty high price for that 10 acres down there that he owned. And so I suggested we sit down and negotiate with him. So me and Mayor Manning met with him and wound up buying the property for their first industrial park in Prairie Grove, which was where Magnatech first built their building. It's now Specialty Fasteners has the property. But that was kind of interesting because Donald Parks was the kind of guy that if you priced something, that's what you wanted for it. And he wasn't for buying the property at the price. And he made a motion before the council not to buy it at that price. And I suggested we meet with him, with Lee King, and try to negotiate a price. And Donald said, no, if that's what he wants, that's what he wants. But the rest of the council decided we could meet with him and try to negotiate a price, and we did, and that's how we got it bought. We met at the old dairy diner or Dairy Queen or whatever it was called downtown Prairie Grove. Lee was operating it at that time. And we talked to him and made him an offer on the property, which he accepted.
How important was that for Prairie Grove to get first the Universal and later Magnatech to there and then to offer local jobs?
Well, it was the first really big employer other than the school that Prairie Grove had. So it provided local jobs, and I know one of the things they had to do to get them to come was waive the property tax for so many years. And Universal Electric and then Magnatech made a contribution to the schools in lieu of taxes. So I never understood why they were so interested in avoiding the property tax when the donations they made to the school were higher than what the taxes would have been.
Do you remember when the other industrial park was developed?
That actually was purchased and started while I was in Pea Ridge. And I'm not sure that was part of the Yost family's farm. And I'm not sure how all that came about, but that was up and going when I moved back to Prairie Grove.
What are some of the other changes in, let's talk about how the bank changed and expanded its facilities when you were there.
Well, we already had a branch in Farmington, and one thing about Harvest, we brought a lot of new products to the market. One was mortgage loans, which is still big for Harvest, but credit cards. There were several services that a small bank like the Farmers and Merchants couldn't offer, but because Harvest can consolidate all the operations areas into one, we could offer. But that was the biggest thing. Excuse me, what was the rest?
Didn't you add some facilities in Prairie Grove, like a drive-in, and expand the bank a little bit?
We added the drive-in bank. We didn't have room in the back alley for an expansion of the drive-in facilities, so we built one, bought the old Conoco service station down on the corner of Neal and Mock, and built a new drive-in facility there. We built a new bank in Farmington, and then we built one in West Fork and one in Lincoln. And we served 4 communities, and as president of the bank, I was over those 4 communities.
Any other stories about Prairie Grove you can think of to share?
Well, there was a shooting at the school when someone saw a student heading toward the school carrying a shotgun, and I think Tom Laux was the superintendent at that time, and they went out to check on it, and then Greg Lovell wound up getting shot with the shotgun, and he still was able to capture the young man, and that was all. He never made it to the school. They caught him before he got to the school. I really don't remember a whole lot of the details, but Tom Laux will probably tell you more than about it than I can.
One last thing, Greg. If someone asked you, someone who didn't know anything about Prairie Grove said, "Tell me about your town of Prairie Grove," what would you tell them?
Well, I think one of the big things for our bedroom community, which that is basically what we are for businesses in Fayetteville and Springdale and Rogers and Bentonville even, but I would tell them our schools were recently rated as number 7 in the state of Arkansas. And I think that was pretty impressive. But it's a good place to live. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of the businesses that we did have. We turned into kind of an antique store, flea market kind of town. But it's got a great community atmosphere, and the school is probably what everything is centered around, and the school activities. And we have a quality city government that provides good services, and the telephone company is undoubtedly one of the better things in the state. I've lived in 3 different communities, and I can tell you from experience, Prairie Grove Telephone Company is among the top of the 3 I lived in.